Okay, great. Well, good evening, everyone here, and thank you for joining us this evening. This is the second in a series of talks entitled the Armchair Naturalist, where we were looking at a variety of topics um, associated with our nature reserves. The first one a few weeks ago was on butterflies, and this one is on grazing, and in particular conservation grazing on our nature reserves. And I'm joined by a few members of the reserve team who will take you through grazing on a particular habitat. But just to set the scene somewhat, I just thought I'd mention a few different things just to help us sort of set the scene. And the first thing to think about really is the state of wildlife in North Wales. There's a couple of reports there that hopefully you can see on the screen that have been produced by Natural Resources Wales. The one on the left-hand side is about species in peril that identifies over 1,000 species that are in peril in North Wales, in Wales, sorry, as a whole. So we're sort of faced with a very serious biodiversity crisis that is combined with the climate crisis as well. And our nature reserves can play a role in this if we can manage them appropriately. And as you'll hear later on, grazing plays a key part in that work as well. So it's just briefly, just to think about what our role is and what we want to see. We want to see nature in recovery in North Wales, where wildlife is abundant and diverse, and natural processes are creating wilder land and seascapes across North Wales. But at the same time, we want people and nature to thrive together. And we set all this out in our strategy for 2030, which you can access via our website. And within that, we have a number of goals. And the key one in terms of our nature reserves is goal one, which is nature in recovery. So that's what the whole nature reserve team is working towards. And for those of you who are involved in any way in working on nature reserves, thank you very much. And I hope you've had the chance to see some of the wonderful wildlife that we do have on our reserves. So we have 35 nature reserves across North Wales and Bryn Ifan as well. And of that, way more than half, over 20 of them have grazing on them to a greater or lesser extent. So you can see that it's a very important tool for us to help us manage the diverse range of habitats that we do have on our nature reserves. Yeah, and so hopefully what we're going to get around to tonight, and you'll get a better understanding of, is what conservation grazing is, why we use grazing and on different habitats, and also where we're doing it on which nature reserves and which particular parts of nature reserves. So tonight, what we're going to be looking at is grasslands, wetlands, and heathlands. And we're going to start off at the bottom of that list with Paul, who will be looking at upland heathland in particular. And then Matt will be talking about grasslands, and Davith will be looking at wetlands, focusing on a particular example. So if you just bear with us for a moment while Paul gets set up and shares his screen, I shall stop sharing my screen so that Paul can share his screen. And I'll just quickly introduce Paul, who's one of our reserves officers in the Northeast, and you may have met him on one of the many tasks that he leads, or maybe out sort of surveying, particularly amphibians and reptiles, or maybe joining in with his black grouse survey. So I shall hand over to Paul, and I will keep quiet for a little while. Paul, over to you.
Marvelous. Can I just check that you can hear me and the screen is sharing as it ought to?
That's all good from my point of view, Paul.
Okay, perfect. So, um, so for my section, I'm gonna speak a little bit about grazing on heath, and I'm gonna look at Gwarchodfeydd as the case study for this. And some of this, if you joined us for the Upland Heathland ecology talk a few years ago, you may have seen some of this, but I've refocused it specifically onto grazing today. But just for context, I wanted to start off looking at what the habitat is. So first of all, it's a man-made habitat, but it's been around in the UK since the Bronze Age. It came about through forest clearance, and it's unusual. It's sort of it's kind of plagioclimactic, so it can be sustained very much at the sort of successional level, which it is, which we'll look at a little bit later on in these slides. Uh, it consists of infertile acidic soils, so it supports uh, a relatively smaller spread of species than calcareous grasslands, for example, but very unique species as well. It's a very specialist niche habitat. Um, so it's low pH, it's acidic, and it's nutrient poor. And the communities that it supports are ericaceous and dwarf scrub predominantly. That's the sort of defining character of heathlands. So heathers and vaccinium type species, blueberry, bilberry, um, and so they're tolerant of these infertile acidic soils. Um, and for it to be heath, it's an open habitat. So these plants, although they're relatively low growing, sort of knee height or waist height if they're getting tall. Um, but they're scrub. They are woody plants. But if it starts to become uh, colonized by birch or rowan or Gwarchodfeydd Natur, then you start to lose that characteristic heathland habitat type. Then you can get wet or dry heath, and indeed you can get both on the same site. You get a mosaic of habitats with some areas wetter, some areas drier. This is represented, or this reflects in the vegetation community that you get across the site. So different species will have their niches in these different hydrological ranges. And then it also reflects the type of habitat that you get. So the wetter it becomes, you get a different um, a different type of habitat again. So heathland there is sort of on the drier end of the spectrum, and then you get your wet flushes, and then when it's very waterlogged, you get your bogs. And we've got this aerial photo from some drone footage that Carl took for us, and this shows the spread of wet and dry very clearly. So the drier sections are these darker areas. This is the heather, and then these paler sections are more rush dominated, and they are wetter sections. Those are flushes, and then you get where the wet sort of concentrates in these channels. You get smaller boggy areas as well. So um, so the other feature which we see on these heathlands is succession, and this is as I've put there, it's a dynamic process, and we'll have a look at what I mean with that on the next few slides, and that's where the grazing comes in. The other feature about heathland specifically, which is um, perhaps a bit more distinct to typical conservation grazing on grassland sites, be it calcareous or acid grassland, is the structure. So there's because we're managing a woody habitat, albeit this dwarf scrub, um, there's a real um, the the scale of the structural sort of microhabitats is very clear to see, and we'll see that on some of the slides. Um, but you have these cycles with the heather where it starts off young and grows and becomes woodier, and then starts to become leggy and gappy and dies off, and then you get new pioneer growth. And what we want on the reserve is we want a nice mixture of these structures. Um, so that brings us on to succession, and very much related to that is management. So on these sort of heathland or potential heathland sites, which are, as we've said, these low nutrient, uh, low pH sites. Uh, if you have low succession, you'll have something acid grassland. And then as you get some succession through to the heathland communities with the heathers and the dwarf scrub, and then if you get more succession, then you get a more woodland community. And this drone footage shows illustrates that up at glywed very nicely. So you can see here, you can see what will be acid grassland. It may have been perhaps enriched a little bit. So this is just off the reserve and would be sheep grazed. Um, but you can see that that is low succession. Then you've got this darker coloration of the heath on the reserve, and then you can see now these are plantations, but you can see this same underlying geology and conditions can sustain this wooded landscape as well. If we look on this slide, you can see all the trees that you can see in this band along here are self-seeded onto the reserve, and so that is the process of succession um, being shown sort of more accurately, if you like, than the sort of artificially planted um, plantations from the previous uh, slide, sorry. And some of these trees here, they're probably the bigger ones are probably about 15 years old or so, and the probably the biggest ones that we've been felling would have been about 25 years or so. And we're currently we're working through the site on a rotation, trying to take out some of these bigger ones. In particular, the trees we've got here are almost all Sitkas, which come in from the surrounding forestry plantations, and they're a non-native species. So to illustrate the different successional levels with photos from the reserve, here you can see acid grassland, which is quite heavily grazed. Um, and then here you can see a more mixed heathland grassland community with a much more varied structure with a big brash pile in the middle from where we've been clearing the trees. And here you see a less managed section of heath where you can see you've got sections where it's starting to get a bit more leggy and it's starting to open up, and you've got some trees starting to colonize in. Um, so looking at management, looking at grazing, um, you in on the lower succession side of things, if you overmanage with respect to heath, you can end up with this more uh, acid grassland habitat, and if you undermanage, you can end up with succession and with it turning over towards woodland. Um, and we want to try and maintain the more unique and species rich or key species heathland habitat. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we've got different management options available. We've got grazing, you've got fire, and you've got machinery, you've got cutting. Um, now, uh, we don't we don't practice burning up at Gwarchodfeydd, um, but we do use a combination of cutting and grazing. And um, you can see on this slide, so this shows quite nicely, it shows the different uh, uh, types of habitat communities that we have on the site. So you can see this is a wet flush up at this end of the, oops, sorry, I accidentally clicked it there. A wet flush at this end of the reserve and another wet section here. And then these darker sections are your heathland. You can see here the more intensively grazed. Now, in these open areas, these wet areas, the sheep which graze the site uh, move around freely, and they disperse through it very easily, and they are pretty much keeping on top of any sitkas that are coming in. Any little saplings get nibbled. We're not seeing colonization of these more open areas, and you can see that's reflected in the photo where you can see the trees. Then there aren't really any trees growing in these more open areas, but the sheep sort of follow a route of least resistance, and they're less keen to push their way through the heather uh, to graze sort of in the thick of it. But what we have found is they will go into these areas that have been cut, and they will graze in there. So as more of the site goes into this rotation of cutting, the sheep will be able to keep on top of the self-seeding um, a little better. Um, so we use a combination of cutting and grazing. Both techniques help create this diversity of structure within the heather, and then the grazing on top of that helps to control the self-seeding of trees coming in from off the reserve. Um, on this image here, you can see a square of acid grassland within the reserve. This area is perhaps, well, from a heathland perspective, it would be overgrazed, and so uh, we would want to see this revert over time towards a habitat more like what you see around it with the heathland. Um, Now, as I've been referring to throughout the presentation, the livestock that we use on this site are sheep, um, but there are a couple of areas like this section here and the area behind it, which are enclosed, where there is potential to incorporate cattle into the grazing regime, and the mixture of species or the mixture of livestock that we use for grazing. That would give, they have a different browse pattern. They would give a slightly different structure on what they graze, and they would also be or they typically they would graze an open area like this less intensively. So that's something which we are looking at the potential of incorporating. But currently, our livestock here is sheep. Um, and then my final slide, because I couldn't bear to do a whole presentation just on grazing and not show any of the animals that we get here. But here we've got an adder, which is a nice representative of um, the species of the fauna that you get on this type of habitat. And that's my piece. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Paul. Excellent. Paul's got quite a challenge at Gwarchodfeydd included. It is our biggest nature reserve at 273 hectares. Just to give you an idea of the scale in some of those slides. So yes, some of the areas that Paul has been cutting are bigger than some of the areas of heathland that we manage on Anglesey. Just to give you an idea of comparative scales in different parts of North Wales, although on Anglesey it is lowland heathland, not upland heathland. Yeah, great, and thanks once again, Paul. So now we're going to move over to Matt, who will be talking a little bit about grasslands on some of the grassland sites that he manages. So, okay, over to you, Matt. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Definitely silence.
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Smashing. And by the way, happy St. Patrick's Day. Right, I'm going to talk to you about grazing initially at Gwarchodfeydd Nature Reserve, which, unlike Gwarchodfeydd we've just been hearing about, some 270 hectares, is about Gwarchodfeydd is some 10 hectares, about 25 acres, I reckon. So a much, much smaller scale. But there, indeed, we're talking about grassland management rather than heathland management. And for those of you that don't know the site, it's really it's in Bangor. It's surrounded by much residential activity and indeed school activity as well. It's a series of five fields surrounded by hedgerows and secondary woodland. And the trust, it's a bit of the history to it. It was earmarked, as I understand, it was earmarked for being built on. Fortunately, it wasn't built on. NRW got involved, and indeed, such was the situation that actually it was too an important bit. The land was too important to build on. And as such, as a result, has been designated an SSSI by the NRW, and it came across to the Trust as a means to manage it. The Trust has had it since 2012, and indeed, so what it was a series of fields which had, as I understand it, had been grazed beforehand, albeit not necessarily very intensively, and it was reverting to scrub, as indeed as Paul was alluding to, in ecological succession, which will inevitably take place if you don't manage an area. Designated SSSI, not actually for its its plant numbers. That said, it has many species of plant, but it's actually for its mycological interest, particularly for its wax caps. Wax caps themselves are quite an indicator species. So much as lichens, if people know about lichens, are used as indicator species pointing to good air quality. The rarer the lichen, the better the air quality. So wax caps indeed are used as indicator species to good grassland habitat. Typically, they're associated with grassland which hasn't been disturbed, hasn't been turned over, haven't been ploughed for a long time. What to do with these fields, indeed, to stop that succession that Paul has talked about from taking place and it going to scrub and going eventually to secondary woodland? Well, indeed, it needs management. It needs cutting. So either we do it by hand, or indeed we do it preferably by using grazing animals. And in this instance, the trust decided to use cattle. Several reasons for that. One of the main reasons for that, indeed, was actually because being surrounded by a lot of public indeed bring dogs. Indeed, there's a lot of dog walkers that use the site, and to be using sheep from the dog point of view would be to be inviting problems. The cattle work really quite well, and as Paul said, the cattle graze in a different manner to sheep, or indeed to ponies, or indeed to rabbits. They only having incisors on the lower jaw, cattle, whereas sheep and having a pad on the top jaw to tear, whereas sheep have incisors, they nibble more, they nibble much closer to the ground. So the cattle are not grazing quite as low, and indeed they're tearing and actually ripping up some of the of that which of the vegetation, which actually is actually quite good, creating in places some bare ground. How many cattle to put on? We currently graze throughout the year on a rotational basis around these 5 fields, between 4 and 6 head of cattle throughout the year. Them only going off, and indeed, actually, I've just got message today to say the cattle will go off every year for TB testing, so they're away for a week or 2 weeks. But other than that, they graze on the reserve throughout the year. That said, they being an SSSI, we're not allowed to feed them any concentrate feedings. There's no supplementary feeding other than salt licks, mineral licks, which on the reserve we keep either move around to stop the poaching too much and gathering around in any one place, or indeed where they are currently is under the blackthorn scrub. The fields themselves I mentioned beforehand, they were going to too much scrub. That said, we don't want them to be entirely devoid of any scrub. And to keep the scrub in check, we ourselves do some management via coppicing. But another reason for using the cattle as opposed to sheep is because indeed they will browse really quite effectively, especially depending on the age of the beast. The older beasts tend to browse more readily the blackthorn, the thorny scrub than younger beasts, but they're also keeping the blackthorn scrub in check as well. Just looking at my notes down here. Yeah, counterintuitively, if that's a word, the poorer the fertility of the soil under the grassland, actually the greater number of plant species it will support. So an important thing to do with the land was to actually reduce its fertility. In the early years, I understand it, there was also, as well as the grazing going, and a hay cut was also taken each year off the fields in order to further reduce the fertility. Now, in my time, which is now 7.5 years with the trust, we've not needed to take a hay cut off. So much have we managed to reduce the fertility of the fields. It is not deemed necessary in order to take hay off. With NRW involved, the optimal sward height we're to aim for at the end of any year is between 4 and 6 inches of grass growth there. The wax caps themselves probably wouldn't mind too much it being taller, but for those of us that go on the fungal forays that we hold each year, it would make life rather more difficult if they were working through rather more dense thatched grass. I said that actually we no longer take a hay cut off That said, this year I did effectively take a hay cut off part of it via means of flailing, which I haven't done previously. That was only necessitated by the fact that the animals this year, well, they came in as they're now about 18 months old. They've been here a year. They were really young when they came in, and so as such, they weren't actually eating much. So it was necessary this year to actually reduce, to take some, effectively some grass, some vegetation off ourselves mechanically. Um, a brief bit about the cattle that we use indeed ourselves. The trust itself doesn't own any grazing animals at all, but we use graziers. And indeed, on the thin oak, we use grazier keyhoes we use of grazing there. As I mentioned, they've been grazing there since 2014. So the whole time that the trust has had it since 2012, we've had one grazier. And they have been very good in terms of not using any concentrates other than these mineral licks, and if necessary, taking beasts off because for one reason or another, they with surrounding schools, particularly with lots of kids. Sometimes we have years when kids tend to like to wind the cattle up. As I try and tell them, if there is an argument, there will only be one winner, and it won't be them. If the cattle do at all get a bit twitchy, then indeed they're very good about taking individuals off and replacing them with quieter individuals. She grazes, so in the past grazed with belted Galloway and Highland Cross. That said, at the minute she's got some more dairy type breed, and Holstein Friesian is in there somewhere. Arguably not ideal, not so much for a problem for a thin old, because actually the grazing is really quite good, so to speak. Whereas conservation grazing in general tends to mean fairly impoverished, rough grazing, the sort of stuff that most dairy breeds would turn their nose up at and say, I ain't eating that. So really, from the point of view of conservation and grazing, certainly from a cattle point of view, you're looking at the older breeds, so breeds such as belted Galloway, Welsh Blacks, the Highlands and Hereford. Basically, these animals don't need a great deal of inputs, don't need a great deal of looking after, and will graze on fairly rough grazing. Talking about looking after, the cattle on Ithinog are some of the most looked at and well attended cattle on the planet, I suggest. There is a lookers regime where indeed on a rotational basis we take turns on a daily basis to look at and check the cattle and the fences to ensure that their welfare is fine. And the other reason, of course, is to check the fences because indeed sometimes surrounded by all these kids, things get cut, fences get cut. So some of the frustrations of dealing with an urban reserve, in general, it's not too much of a problem, touch wood. And that is just about all I've got for you. Thanks for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Matt. That was quite a nice contrast with the sort of the large scale of Paul's Gwarchodfeydd fluid and the very sort of specifics of managing a thing. And I think you made some good points about how they graze differently and the different impacts of that, including the browsing. So I think that was good, and perhaps we might come back to that with the questions at the end. Okay, right. So next we're on to Dewch, who's going to talk about wetlands over at Bryn Ifan. And if Dewch is there, I shall unmute him.
Hello, good evening.
Good evening. Hi, Dewch. Are you all right?
I do a sound check like everyone else.
Do you want to share your screen? And
here we go.
Yeah.
Bear with me. We're getting there.
Excellent. So Dewch is our project officer down at Bryn Ifan, where his main focus is on creating a Celtic rainforest, but as a little sideline, he looks after a rather important wetland. So over to you, David.
All right, Noswaith, good evening. So I'm going to discuss a more of a concentrated view of how grazing affects one site and the main targeted species, which is quite nice for me only having a little wetland, unlike some of my colleagues. So this here is Gwarchodfeydd. Some of you might know it, but for you, those of you who don't know it,
Hi, David. Sorry to interrupt. Are you sharing your screen at the moment? 'Cause all I can see
I
is you.
thought, okay, I thought it was. Right. Oh, I love Zoom. Bear with.
So it should be in the bar at the bottom.
Yeah.
It worked earlier, didn't it? Oh, there you go. Something's coming.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah, it's coming through. Give it a moment. I think. Yep. There. Can see your screen or your screensaver, should I say? There you go. Excellent.
Lovely. All right,
Yeah.
so let's work out how
Back
to
to
move all of
you.
you people away. Lovely. Yeah. So, did you catch the first bit? So yeah, this is Gwarchodfeydd, and for you ones of you who don't know about Gwarchodfeydd, just a bit of an insight of where we are. So Bryn Ifan is the farm. Unlike the rest of our sites, it's a farm and not a reserve. And we're based here at the base of Bwlch Mawr, between Clynogfawr and Pantglas, just on the edge of the Llyn Peninsula. So here's an aerial view looking down on the site. Mostly wetland, although it's quite a dry wetland as far as wetlands go. And most of it's open, but we do have these areas of scrub, and that's where cattle management comes into it. And a bit more about the sites. Gwarchodfeydd is the name, and it's a triple SI for marsh fritillary butterflies, and that's the main reason we're grazing on the site, to try and get the numbers right and get the balance of grazing correct. Although we want to get as many different species on the site as we can, the main concentration around here is the marsh fritillary butterfly. So yes, the first picture is standing on the hill. This is at Bwlch Mawr, and this is the area we hope to do some planting in. And looking down, we're now stood here in Gwarchodfeydd. And if you walk around the site, you'll see quite a few posts and signs with the marsh fritillary and its main food plants, the devil's spit scabious. So a bit more about the marsh fritillary first, so we understand why we need to graze the sites. It's quite a delicate species. A lot of things can affect it, what type of weather we get, how the site is managed, that's where the grazing comes in on it, and how the populations in the area are doing as well. So this is the main plant we're trying to get on the site. It's the devil's bit scabious, and this is the main food plant for the marsh fritillary. So just going a little bit into the life of the marsh fritillary butterfly. The way we understand how many we've got is through something called a larval web count. So on this plant here now, we can see just at the bottom, this little collection, this little web, like a little spider web almost. And looking across here to the top middle picture, a bit more of a zoom in, and zooming in a bit more again, until we get into this last picture here. So just giving a bit of an understanding what we're looking at. This big web here works away across the plant as the caterpillars move up the plant, eating its way through. All these little black dots here. Initially, I thought they were caterpillars and I got quite excited, but I learned that was poo. This little thing here in the middle, this is the little caterpillar, and eventually it becomes an adult. It goes through quite a complicated life cycle. Just quickly here, I'll skim through this, but mate soon after hatching from the pupa. Eggs are laid in mid-May, June. Hatch late July. Feed on food plants inside the web. This is called the first insta larvae. followed by second instar larvae. There's a lot more detail. I'm just trying to zoom quickly through its very busy life. By late September, it's into its third instar larva, and they spin a thicker web, and then they move low into the vegetation to overwinter. So this is our narrow window when we can go and do a larval web count before they disappear down. But with our weather, we get quite often the webs get washed away, or we don't get the right weather window ourselves to get out there to do the count. So it can be a bit tricky. Following year, February, March, they reach into their fourth instar, where they form a basking platform within a web. But sometimes if the weather is a bit cold, which we do get that time, they can go a bit lower down again. So seeing these elusive creatures are quite tricky at times. Then goes on to the fifth instar. They'll leave the web at this stage and they start feeding out on the plant and become more distributed. So initially they're all together and they start moving out to this stage. Finally, they come to the sixth instar, where they are fully grown and pupa go into the chrysalis, where they undergo metamorphosis to become a butterfly, that bit where they sort of change shape and become into more like a butterfly. Getting ready to pupate in late April to mid-May, and then it's soon going back into the same cycle again. So they have a very short-lived and very busy life through each stage. So they've got enough to manage. So it's only fair that we try and get the grazing right for them. So just a bit of an overlook ecologically on the site. There's a lot of dotted colours here, but if we look at the sort of mainness, we've got the light blue here, and this is of marshy grassland, rush pasture. Then we've got the dark green again, marshy grassland, but more grass pasture. And then this brownness around the edges here, this is the dense scrub we've got. So going back to what Paul was saying earlier, ways of managing sites. So there was mouth, match, or machine. Again, we don't burn on our sites for obvious reasons. So we do use machine and grazing. We do try and minimize how much we use machine. We've used it a couple of times in the last few years, and that's mostly just to get better control on the grazing. If the sward gets too high, too tough, it becomes unpalatable and the grazing animals won't feed on it. So if we can cut it back, it makes it more palatable, and then we can get the management a bit better. But it is quite tricky getting the balances right. So you have to look at what numbers we can put on the site. So we look at usually around about 12 cattle, depending on the size. And obviously by the size, it depends how much dry matter each one of the beasts or each one of the cattle need. But that gives a rough idea. But also it's not all about marsh fertility. We've got some lovely cotton grass and other flowers, and even a few snakes popping around. This one's just in a bit of a funny little shape because he was sitting underneath one of the reptile refugia we've got surveying the site. So he'd gone into the nice corrugated iron shape. So what can we do to improve grazing on a site? There are a lot of options, things you can look at. Each site is different. So here I've just gone over a bit of what you can do on other sites. I wouldn't look at electric fencing on my site, but it is a way of being able to control where they're going, because we don't always want to have them stock set because they might be eating too much devil's bit scabious. They might be trampling or creating rougher areas. So we do want to have some kind of control over them. One of the ways I would like to see a corslad to be collars. This isn't one of our cows. Sadly, as we don't have collars in ours yet, I had to nick a picture of the internet. But it's just a good way that you can select where you want to graze, get the pressure right, and really it's just a bit of a balance. There's no right or wrong way. It's just a case of trying and watching. The main thing is watching the land, seeing what heights the sward's at, seeing what species are getting eaten or not getting eaten. If there are areas of thicker scrub, can we look at getting machines in there, getting volunteers and ourselves in with handsaws and loppers, opening up areas so cattle can get into them? So this is a good way of looking at the site. Not as open. Look, a lot of the pictures I shown earlier showed nice open areas. We do have this thick scrub with a big Sitka spruce plantation next to us, so we get a lot of self-seeded coming in. Down on this little corner just off the screen, so I'd say probably this sort of area here is all south-facing, and that's what they tend to like, the marsh fritillary butterfly. And there's only sort of one area of it that is very open, the rest isn't. So that's where our grazing and management is coming in. How can we improve this site? What needs to be done? And there are other options. You can use ponies as well, but I'm quite keen on using cattle. They're good mowers. They're easy to handle, and you can be a lot more selective and have more choice. You can choose your breeds, as Matt was talking about earlier, having hardy breeds like belted Galloways or Highlands or Welsh Blacks. At the moment, we've got stabilizer cattle. They're doing quite well there. They tend to come on as it starts drying off around about April, and we'll keep them on until about September. And so far, it's working quite well for us. All we need is the weather to improve, and hopefully that'll help the marsh fritillary don't get washed out each year. But yeah, I think that's bringing me to the end, really. There's only so much you can say about a cow eating grass, but hopefully I've managed to cover the benefits for us and how they're working well for us. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, David. There's a couple of questions just appearing in the chat. So I'll come on to those. Just a quick question for you though, David, since you're still there. You talked about the scrub at Bryn Ifan. How are we managing the scrub in particular in relation to the marsh fritillary, and what role do the cows play in that?
So I touched upon it. How we're opening it up, we're either using machinery or sending, we're going in ourselves. So manually, handsaws, chainsaws, loppers, working through, cutting roots inside. We don't want to so clear it all. And the scrub also plays a really vital role for the marsh fritillary as well, because they're quite a weak flyer. So we need to make sure they've got the windbreaks, they've got the shelter in there. But it's just making sure we don't get too much scrub encroaching across the site. So it's a really careful balance. We want scrub, we just don't want it to over encroach. So cutting pathways in is a good way then for the cattle to push in. And it's amazing, you'll go there one day, you'll cut a route through, and you'll go there the following day, and there'll just be obvious signs of cattle throughout, we shall say.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, David. And first question for you though, John Hayden has noted that Bryn Ifan is a farm, not a nature reserve, as you said, and he asks, is there a chance it could be a model for other farms in the area, or do the other local farms go their own way?
I think it's a mix. I always struggle with a sort of model farm or demonstration farm. I don't want to look as if we're playing or experimenting. We want to have a solid farm business going at Bryn Ifan. We have got quite a few good contacts in the local area that are very keen in what we're doing, wanting to get involved, whether that be through having their grazing animals on our land, or there's other parts of Bryn Ifan where we're doing things such as meadow creation. They're very interested in having some of the seed source off the site to be able to have it on their own areas. We've got a neighbour just across the road from us who's doing permaculture farming. We work very closely with them as well. And my main sort of holdback at the moment is my sort of tree planting I need to do at Bryn Ifan. That has to happen before we can start doing proper farming.
Yeah.
And that's taken a little longer than I'd hoped. So hopefully, as we move on with the project, we can get much more involved with everyone in the area. But it's definitely starting.
Yeah, cool. Great. Yeah. Thanks, David. And I suppose it's worth adding to that as well in looking at the broader picture in terms of our nature reserves, but also the work of the Wildlife Trust. In that we're looking at the sustainable farming scheme, and we're aiming to go into it. And we will share the experience of all farmers in trying to understand the sustainable farming scheme and how you work with the scheme to get the best benefits for wildlife in the wider countryside. Great, yeah, thanks. So a question also from Polly, who, and I'll give this one to Matt. How many people are involved in the various sites? Do you use volunteers?
Oh, so not just the thin oak.
Yeah, just generally, I
Uh,
suppose, yeah.
uh, as I'm sure Paul and David will agree, if it weren't for volunteers, then the trust were, and Chris indeed as well, if it weren't for the volunteers, the trust wouldn't be doing a fifth of what it does.
Yeah.
So volunteers from all walks, and indeed doing all sorts of different things. So when I think of volunteers, typically I'd think of doing practical management on the site. Yes, we do need numbers for doing that, and we have good numbers. From my point of view, we go out every Wednesday, and indeed onto reserves on Anglesey, and we'll have typically 8 of us, 12 of us. Sometimes when we go out with the students, we could have up to 20 of us going out, but typically week on week, 8 to 12 of us go out doing practical management, but also typically what's coming into the fore now is doing some survey work. Typically, so the first thing that starts off really, am I muted?
No, no,
No,
no.
I'm not.
You're right. You're right.
So reptile surveys going on. So and typically, yes, some of the regular volunteers in terms of the practical conservation volunteers will get involved that as well. But that said, there are others that get involved that purely do the survey work as well. And we need people to do all these different jobs. So it's surprising how many volunteers, how many people there are out there that want to volunteer and to do all sorts of different things, from indeed practical management to survey work to things. Just people say, "I just want a litter pick." Well, actually, on sites, particularly like Ethinog that we've been talking about, that is just so vitally important. If people will see that a place is looked after and loved, then that tends to get them looking after themselves and feeling guilty for indeed dropping the rubbish in the first place. So just as vitally important.
Great. Yeah. Cheers, Matt. Thanks for that. And I think, as Matt was saying, Matt regularly gets sort of between 8 and 12 people on Bangor and Anglesey reserves, but 4 or 5 days of the week we can get similar numbers across some of our other sites in North Wales as well. Whether it's Gwaith Powder down in the south, or Marford and Monera quarries over in the east. So tremendous amount of work. So volunteers are just really important to us, and they also play other important roles in some of the other parts of the trust activities as well, away from nature reserves. Um, I think that's the last question in the chat. If anyone's got any more questions, please do add them. I was going to ask Paul a question, really, and it was just picking up on sort of the way that Matt's and Davith's talks went. So Davith was focusing on the work that we're doing there for marsh fertility, and Matt was talking in particular about sort of the grassland fungi and as to why Aethinog is important. But Paul, I was just wondering, how do we decide at Gwarchodfeydd Fluid what it looks like? How do we decide how much of those different successional stages for heather that we want? So how much cutting we might do, and how heavily graze. So how do we make those sorts of decisions when it comes to managing the whole site?
So the there's sort of two components to how we want to split the habitats on the reserve. So we've got a management plan that guides and informs what our priority habitats are, and the three key ones are the siliceous flushes, the siliceous flush communities, the blanket bog communities, and the heather communities. And then within the heather communities, it describes, and I'll quote here, to manage the age and structural diversity of the heather communities towards a more favourable condition. And what on the heather management slide that I showed, which showed the life cycle of the heather plant and the different structural forms that it goes through, you're looking at something like a 15 to 20 year cycle, and we want to always have some parts of the reserve in each of these stages. So you'll have seen, I didn't focus on it very much in the talk because we're focusing more on the grazing than the cutting, but you'll have seen these really weird artificial squares and rectangles dotted across the site. And that's where we've done the cutting, and they're in a sort of grid pattern, and the idea is that we don't want to cut areas completely linked up, so that's why they are disconnected from each other, and that's to keep access relatively low between them for mammalian predators, so foxes and stoats and weasels, because we're trying to encourage black grouse and red grouse in particular on this habitat. So we don't want to give them, we don't want to give the predators sort of super highways through this quite dense heathland. So in the same way that the sheep will take the lines of least resistance, so will the predators. But we're cutting sort of this almost checkerboard pattern, and then we'll come back in on a cycle. So we'll cut squares in one patch in 1 year, and then another patch another year, another patch, and I've got a 4 year cycle to cover different parts of the reserve. And then on year 5 we come back to our original patch, and we cut squares sort of adjacent again. And so what that'll mean is that over a 16-year cycle, or 16 to 20 year cycle, each of the patches that we are managing, and we'll leave a proportion of the reserve unmanaged, uncut, so that we haven't got disturbance there. But each of those components will then have the maximum diversity of structural habitats within it. So that's the rationale behind how we approach it, and the weird squares that you see on those aerial photos.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. That was a really comprehensive answer. Thank you very much. Okay, so I don't think there are any more questions in the chat that I can see. Nope. So yeah, I've just put a few links into the chat about volunteering with us, about events. The next online talk will actually be by myself next week about Kemlyn. Looking forward to the new season at Kemlyn, one of the most important seabird colonies in Wales. But then there's also some other events out there in the real world. So please do join into some of these events, and hopefully we'll see you out there on our nature reserves in the very near future. Just before we finish, let's have a look. So okay, so I'm hopefully you can see my screen with a rather large elk on it, and this is just a plug for a talk that actually happened last night, that was organised by the Royal Society for Wildlife Trusts, our umbrella body, where they were looking at the UK's missing giants, and this was looking at some of the large herbivores that are missing from the UK landscape, and why we need them. And it was a really interesting talk with experts from Europe sort of chipping in on about bison and about elk and their role in restoring wildlife at scale in big landscapes. So yeah, so if we sort of whet your appetite for more talk about grazing, I recommend logging onto the Wildlife Trust's YouTube channel and having listened to that talk. It's one of a series of wildlife events. They've all been really interesting across a wide range of topics. Yeah, and just finish off with just picking up on what I've mentioned in the chat with the sort of the reference to our membership. And if you'd like to hear some more news other than our newsletter, you can sign up for our e-newsletter as well. Yep. Right. Okay. So I think we're just about draw it to a close, and I'd like to thank Paul, Matt, and Davith for the time tonight and for giving us an insight into grazing on those different habitats. And I hope everyone enjoyed themselves this evening, and we'll leave you to get on with the rest of your evening. Yeah. Dewch, goodbye. Hopefully see you all soon. Thanks.
Cheers, Chris. Cheers all.